I will share a little my thoughts around the challenges of the digital infrastructure from a free press and democracy perspective. Democracy relies on citizens' ability to obtain trustworthy information on public matters, to understand them, and to engage. Where big tech platforms provide citizens with new opportunities to access information, express opinions, and participate in democratic processes, they can also undermine democracy by blocking information, distorting information, promoting false stories, and facilitating political manipulation. The risk, as I see it, have many aspects. Some of them are political surveillance, loss of privacy, social, political fragmentation, distortion of electoral outcomes, disinformation, censorship, algorithmic bias, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. Tech business models, as we also have discussed earlier today, are based on profits, not the core values that underlie the Nordic welfare state as humanity, equality, trust, justice, democracy, solidarity, and freedom. We have a new world order, as I see it. Tech markets power is immense. Meta has over 3 billion daily users. They make sky-high revenues. Tech companies have extremely skilled people. They work smart. And only they know what tomorrow brings because they have the market experience, they have the know-how, they possess the data, they have the brain power, they have the data power, they have the user data, and they have the finances to invest heavily in and develop new technologies and services. The monopoly of data can be used proactively in the consumer market and the public and private markets. So we may be bound by something we do not know at signing, something we cannot assess properly, and something we become dependent on. Ultimately, tech can decide what content and services we as consumers and citizens can access. They also have political power and influence. They top EU's lobby list. Even though we have become, as citizens and policymakers, more skeptical towards big tech, they still have great access to policymakers and administrations. They engage on local levels, they build relationships, they support and finance great projects, researchers, youth organizations, community, etc. They become members of local industry organizations. Today's event is streamed on YouTube. It underlies somehow our dilemma. You know, we use them, they are convenient, they are for free, we are fascinated by them, and then we became dependent on them, and now they are in control. So the infrastructure gap between global tech companies and the rest of us challenge democracy and citizens' fundamental rights. And this gap leads to other gaps, such as information gap, data gap, privacy gap, discrimination gap, bias gap, security gap, accountability gap, value and trust gap. A lot of gaps. So it's the Wild West, actually. You know, tech giants, they don't lose sleep over regulation. They don't lose sleep over EU regulation. They challenge every decision we come with from national authorities, from the EU Commission. And when it comes to violation of the law, big tech top the list. And they use the power they have. In Australia, we saw during the corona crisis, they blocked news. Meta did. Meta has blocked news in Canada. They use the power they have. As Trudeau stated in August, Meta is putting profit ahead of safety by blocking wildfire news. Policymakers try to address this kind of challenges, which leads into complexity in regulation, also mentioned by the previous panels. AI Act, Data Act, Data Governance Act, DSA, DMA, European Medium Freedom Act, Copyright Directive, Defense of Democracy Package, NIST 1 and 2, DORA, CER, CRA, EU's Cybersecurity Strategy, Cyber Resilience Act, and I could continue. So much legislation, so many great words, great initiatives, great intention, and so many new rules to implement, so many new boards, offices, centers, observatories, panels, code of conduct, code of practices. Will they be able to coordinate, as Thijs also mentioned? Will we be able, to implement this effectively? So actually all the good intention will have a life in real worlds, so we can enforce them firmly. I'm concerned. Will big tech open the black box? I doubt it. Fundamental rights are at stake. Right to liberty, right to security, respect for private life, protection of personal data, freedom of expression and information. Tech giants control our critical infrastructure. Legislator introduces new rules and regimes, but will big tech play by the rules? Or do we risk to create new barriers for our own industry, the free press, and fundamental rights and innovation? Complex legislation is rarely effective legislation, and it can be circumvented, and the lack of clarity will be exploited. Can we expect effective enforcement of all this great legislation? When it comes to EU regulation, we all know that maybe at the end of the day, we will end up with a preliminary request at the Court of Justice of the EU. And then it will go back and forth and back and forth. And then if we are lucky in 5 to 10 years' time, we will have a final decision. Where will we be in 10 years' time? National authorities, European authorities, do they have the right resources? Do they have the right competences to enforce firmly? We also experience at the same time changes in user behavior. Social media takes space, especially for the younger generation. We learn every day of the rapid decline of the journalism industry, with declining readership, with declining viewership, layoffs of news organizations. Public interest content, whether it's majority or minority, has instrumental value for achieving various societal goals, such as intergroup dialogue, understanding, participation, empowerment, engagement, conflict prevention, and holding people with power accountable. In the Nordics, we often proudly highlight our strong, free, and diverse press and media and public service media as a kind of explanation for our strong cohesion and high level of trust, as a pluralistic press carries our Nordic values. BBC is now only the 5th biggest online publishers in the UK, with big tech quartet of Alphabet, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft taking the top 4 spots. It is an astonishing level of power and revenue for foreign-owned companies. Takes global control of social media, infrastructure, and the advertising technology that underpins the internet, means that whatever size our audience have, even a shared Nordic audience, we are extremely small. And on top of that, even the concept of a mass audience is becoming outdated. So we have a lot of challenges, as I see it. But we also have opportunities. We have a Nordic cooperation. Together, we should be front runners, also in Europe. We should increase our cross-ministerial cooperation, our cross-sectoral cooperation. We should work even stronger and more together with researchers, NGOs, policymakers, administrations, interest groups to make a difference. We need to collaborate across the board on a completely different scale than before, and maybe even put historical differences between us, because the challenges now and ahead demand it. We need to ensure that we still can create great Nordic content. We need to discuss the solutions for how we do ensure this, and how we do ensure accessibility and findability of Nordic national public interest content across a comprehensive offer of global media and platforms. And that is key, because we need to address misinformation and disinformation, including foreign information manipulation and interference. The AI Act, the DSA, and the DMA, as the previous panel discussed, will address some of the issues, but not all. We need to take back control over infrastructure and content distribution. There is more at stake than just money. It's our fundamental rights and democracy. Our decision needs to be wise. It needs to reflect our values, not just a budget. We need to turn research findings into politics that we can implement and which will become effective in practice. And key is cooperation. It's key is an open-minded discussion as we have today, where we exchange perspectives and knowledge, challenge ourselves, and discuss new tools. So despite we may represent different backgrounds and interests, we all care about Nordic values, our strong Nordic democracies. Democracy is a hard right to win. It's easier to lose. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, for that introduction. First and foremost, we are a Swedish news provider. We're a Swedish organization, Swedish ownership. We follow Swedish press ethical rules, and we're based on Swedish democratic values. But we cover news about Sweden and Swedish society in a different language than Swedish, and that's Arabic. And why Arabic? Well, since 2018, Arabic is the second largest mother tongue in Sweden. It's quite a big population, about 600,000 Arabic speakers in Sweden today. If we are talking about democracy or media's role in a democracy, we need to also look at the media landscape and what we're offering the citizens. And if this offering is adjusting accordingly to our population. A lot has happened in the past 10 years. Sweden's population does not look the same as it did 10 years ago. So that's why I believe that we are an important part in this democracy, to be able to provide news for people who maybe don't have access to information because of language barriers, but there can be other barriers as well. A lot of people heavily depend on us for information about Sweden and Swedish society, and they know that they can come to our platforms, our website or app for trustworthy professional news. But when looking at other platforms such as social media, it's a completely different story. On social media, professional, trustworthy, nuanced content is not what is rewarded. What's rewarded on social media is engaging content. Basically, the more emotional, the more sensational the content is, the more it will be boosted. The algorithms will support the reach of that content. And so essentially, we are competing with not only global news providers in Arabic. Arabic is a global language, such as Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya. They are state-owned, remember, so that's in some parts propaganda channels also. But we're also competing with individual or different kind of sites or content creators that don't follow press ethical rules in any way whatsoever. They're usually anonymous. They have some sort of political agenda, and they spread a lot of misleading information. And so on social platforms, we are competing on the same conditions. And that's a big challenge for us. And that's a big challenge for not only us, but for a lot of media companies. But the difference is our target audience is much more fragile. These are people who just recently came to Sweden, who just recently came to a democracy. They're not used to free media. They are skeptical towards media and state institutions because where they come from, the media is state-owned and state-regulated, like I mentioned. So that's why I believe that access to information is a problem to parts of our population because they are being bombarded by information from different sources, and it's sometimes hard for them to navigate, which leads them to not having which leads to information gaps in our society.
That's super interesting because the fight that you guys are fighting is in three ways, because not only you're fighting these platforms where the rules are completely different, you are trying to share values for Swedish society to an audience that might not be aware of those values. So I wonder a little bit, how do you guys leverage that clash of logics, if we call them like that?
Well, the difference between us and other I call them content creators, but they are just random sites that look like news providers, but they are not journalists. We are journalists, so our job is to find out the truth, and that's what we're trying to do. And we've existed for 12 years, and ever since we started, our purpose is to help support integration in Sweden, because we don't want anyone in Sweden to not have access to correct information, and that includes what it means to live in a democracy. Why is freedom of speech not only sometimes hurtful when, for example, burnings of religious books happens, but it can also be very beneficial for you because you can finally express your political opinions. So things like that, that's how we work.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to look into like Thomas also, because I wonder a little bit what are the unique challenges that public service media in this context also operates. Like how dependent is Swedish radio on global tech giants to ensure this universal service?
Well, we are of course dependent in every aspect, I would say, as everyone has said here. If I may, I would like to talk about a specific area, to be kind of precise, an area that I've been working a lot with, and that is an area where you can have all the dependencies focused in one single spot. All the challenges are kind of brilliantly exposed in this area, and that's the car. Because of the radio, the radio industry is extremely dependent on the car. About 65% of all listening in cars is on radio. So it's a massive place. And for us, the car is like 50% of the consumption. So the car is super important when it comes to broadcast. But there is an interesting conflict, because there is now the connected cars where you have the IP services, your apps, that is also present, right? So how do we kind of see this environment working together when you also add stuff like voice? What happens when you ask for, let's say, a radio channel or a specific podcast? What happens then? Like, what do you want as a broadcaster to happen? Because we are often in the hands of the tech giants directing us to different sources. So we have broadcast that is like super easy, push of a button, always been there, super habit. But we also see that the car manufacturers are kind of saying, well, it's kind of tricky to have FM chips or DAB chips in the car, because it kind of interferes when you have electrical cars. It's kind of hard to implement it. So perhaps we should skip it. Volvo talked about it a couple of years ago quite openly, like, why should we have FM? There's no law. We could skip it. We'll try in China first, and then we'll see what happens. Actually, it was for real. And then, so we have that fear of they're not understanding the power of broadcast. And then you have like, how should we kind of be prominent in the IP world, where you have super big companies like Spotify integrating their stuff, being the top prominent services, and we kind of, as the most trusted service that public service generally are, especially in Nordics, we should be equally prominent as the most prominent. I think that's something that we could demand from either the car manufacturers or even legally, that we should be like equally prominent as the most prominent service in the car. And that's of course open to a lot of discussions around legislation, I think.
Yeah. But it also comes to discussions, for example, what we talked about resilience. For example, having FM is something that works without internet, right? And if there is a need for actually communicating something, that's a perfectly good way to do it without needing the other side of the infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's a truly unbelievable situation that we have a government that kind of, on the one hand, says that FM is super important because of the contingency and the preparedness. I mean, that is like the definition of preparedness, the FM. But on the other hand, don't kind of make any legislation on that it has to be there. The next step should, of course, be that there is a legislation on FM in the car. There is a legislation on DAB in the car, but in Sweden we don't have fully DAB. It should be FM, of course. For me, it's quite hard to understand.
And how would this regulation would look like? Like, for example, just the car manufacturers, or is there a specific? I'm trying to figure out how would some kind of regulation on this, like the accessibility to radio transmitters. How do you see it?
I would say that the first step would be like, there is a Finnish automotive law that says that it should be an existing FM receiver in the car. I think that's a quite good start. And then, of course, there's probably other areas where you could look at this, but specifically in cars. I mean, we have seen that in Ukraine when all powers go out, there's no internet, there's no power, but there's one place where you can listen to radio, and that's the car. When you turn on the engine, it works.
Yeah.
So it's super important and quite weird that we don't have it.
That's super interesting because it also adds a little bit of discussion about what is the role of the state. At what point can a regulator dip its fingers into how companies operate? And the case, for example, in Norway is a little bit different, and I will pass it to John. The Tinius Trust, of which you are the board member, has signaled that they are suing the government of Norway over a new surveillance authority given to the police security services in surveying internet data. And I guess that the argument is that it conflicts with the Constitution. So I would ask you to tell us a little bit more about the case for those of us who are a little bit unfamiliar with that.
I'll try to do that briefly. I and colleagues in my law firm are representing in that case, which I think will be initiated in a week or two. I mean, this regards another aspect of the new digital environment. There's a trough of information there that corporate entities like, we know that, user information, but of course also our public authorities, police authorities, and intelligence authorities, and I'm sure this isn't new to any of you. So to put it simply, this is just a case in Norway because we have some new regulation on sort of mass bulk surveillance from the intelligence services, foreign intelligence services, which are similar to, for instance, the Swedish FRA legislation, which recently was tried in the European Court of Human Rights and sort of passed slightly with some amendments, and the British system has been tried there, and there have been these type of systems have been tried in the European Court of Justice as well, under the Charter and the e-privacy directive. So I could be boring and say this is just another one of those cases with our new legislation that we've identified is not up to the standards we believe that the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice have set in their precedents recently. But this has to do, of course, with everyone's privacy, but also we're talking about the media protection of sources, and that is a big that is a big problem today. The protection of journalists' sources is strong, in the sense that it's almost impossible in Europe now to get a court to demand that a journalist actually reveals his sources. But that's the easy way. Then you're faced with it. You know your source. So the police say, we want to know who your source is, and you can go to the courts. So it's much more fun for these authorities to go the back door and look at communications and see who communicated with the journalist, of course. So that's why the Tinius Trust has said they're going to finance this case, because it's going to cost money, because we're against the state, and all the press organizations in Norway, the Editors Association, Press Association, Journalists Association, and some others, and the Media Owners Association, which is represented here today as well, are also third-party interveners there. So I don't think it'll be boring to talk more about that case in itself, but that's another side of all these things we're talking about now. There is so much information out there, and I think the interesting thing is we have our own authorities worrying about the tech giants and data privacy and our personal data, which is good, but on the other hand, they love that information themselves. And their appetite for that information has really grown the past 20 years. Whether it's terrorism, that was first after 9/11, London, Madrid. When that sort of waned a bit and there wasn't too much terror in Europe, it was child exploitation. And now it's cyber attacks, again, against this digital infrastructure. They haven't been able to explain how collecting data on everyone's communication all the time is going to prevent cyber attacks. And the technologists also say that this is the wrong attitude, and that's not the reason they want to do it. It's other reasons, but this goes into the infrastructure as well. Protecting our infrastructure or the proper or the serious infrastructure or points against cyber attacks should, and to a much larger extent, be done at the source, because it's really that's the problem now. Trying to say that the whole infrastructure has to be under surveillance to find out if someone is trying to attack valuable information that the authorities hold, like the military or something like that, instead of protecting it at the source. But we've made ourselves vulnerable in that sense as well. We've just seen with the first presentation how even our government authorities are completely dependent on this infrastructure. So
I totally. I mean, for me. This is one of this specific case illuminates something that often. For those of you who don't know me, I'm originally from Spain, so it's always fascinated me how Nordic citizens trust on their governments. We wouldn't trust our government for anything, and how here most of the conversation is about how we can regulate more. And this specific case kind of goes onto that other direction about maybe not how we regulate more or less, but what do we regulate and who we regulate. And I think that that's a very good discussion. How do you see, for example, in that terms of regulation, the independence of editorial media and that reliance on infrastructures vis-a-vis either third parties like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and the role of the state?
Well, I mean, of course, that's also a vulnerable position, or the editorial media are in a vulnerable position in many senses, even specifically with the revenue part, and being dependent largely on these tech giants to be available to people, run by some very few, basically, individuals in the world. I think that's the problem with almost everything we've discussed, is all that power on the hands of very few private owners. But what worries me, which we touched upon especially in the policy session, is this tendency to want to regulate these platforms. We talk about disinformation, false information. I don't want to live in a society where public authorities decide what is true and isn't true. We've always lived with grades of truthfulness. The media, the editorial media, everything they publish isn't 100% true. I mean, you're academics, most of you here. That's the credo. No one decides what's the truth, what was the historical fact. This is under revision all the time, peer review. We get closer to the truth in natural sciences and social sciences all the time. But there's a tendency now to think that we somehow can define, apart from all the half-truths and semi-truths that are out there and have always been out there, that suddenly there's something which is just untrue by definition, by law, and someone has to take it down. And that worries me, because that's going to go further on to the normal media once you start. And what about these platforms? We know how you said they're worried about their money. If they have too many obligations of being sort of gatekeepers on disinformation, they're going to take down things very quickly just to avoid being held accountable. And they're going to take down editorial media stuff, which you already gave examples of them doing. So I think in that sense, we're going down a wrong track. Disinformation has always existed. And you talk about algorithms. We have to think back in history. I mean, never in history has the normal citizen been able to speak his word to the world as much as before. In 1990 and previously, you had to go through the editor of a media or a publishing company and publish your book to be able to speak to anyone else than the people in the room who could listen to you. And you're talking about algorithms, it's always been like that. In a pub or a cafe, the guy sitting at a table talking about boring academic things was on his own, whereas the guy sitting telling lies and gossip from the village, it was crowded, that table. People never really cared about the truth, they want entertainment. And that is a human problem. And okay, it's become bigger now. I'm not trying to say it's not a problem, but we have to recognize this isn't new. And we have had times when authorities have dealt with what is true and not. We had censorship. And they used that to say, you cannot say that the earth is round because it's flat. And we mustn't go back to that. And it's too easy to say, but we all know it when we see real fake news. No, we don't, and we'll never really agree on what that is. So that is sort of a warning, the way the EU is going, talking about that. I think that's a little bit dangerous. And we've always had to teach ourselves and the population to be critical of the sources of information. And that's the same. It's just become a little bit bigger, the problem, but it's always been like that. Yeah. And I think, it's not a quick fix, but I think we still have to stick, we're talking about our ideals. Our ideals are through freedom of expression and information to exchange ideas, bad ideas and good ideas, correcting each other along the way. And once we start censoring things, because this is false, and this is not right, and governments, I mean, politicians, what do? They disinform the public all the time. And I'm not saying lying, but they're always telling, if you vote for me, it's going to be like this. And it never is it? I mean, it's just part of the game. When does it become disinformation, which is so serious that you're going to fine Facebook or someone for letting that post stay up?
Obviously, fake news have always existed, and I agree that it's now this democratization of who gets to talk. And I would say that this is the reason why we cannot have nice things, and it's because sometimes this is a problem. But point taken, that this type of regulation, who gets to decide how we use data, needs to go on both ways.
There's this character in Norway. There's like he's a dragon or an elephant, crocofant. Fant, yes. He was on the toilet, and that was on the cover of the app when you had to download the app. And what happened? They canceled it. They stopped it on Google Play Store. So that is extremely problematic when they go in and kind of paste in an American or a very frightened cultural perspective on our production. So that's the 180 degrees from that.
No, but this is a little bit that discussion about the power, and I can bring it back to Karen, who so adeptly outlined some of the problems and the many gaps that we have. And I'm trying to think a little bit about how do you see the kind of power that independencies that Nordic media has with these US-owned platforms, and like you were talking about how we depend on them and we kind of have to cooperate in order to kind of fight. I wonder, how do you see that fight and that dependency that at the same time we have? It's not like we can get rid of them like that.
No, definitely not. They're here to stay and develop. And I think with AI, it will be even greater or worse or whatever you say. I think it's a great dilemma, actually. And I try to be a kind of positive person with a positive approach to life. I want to see the world in colors, not black and white, not them and us. So I think we need to cooperate. We need to acknowledge they are here and we need to act wisely. But to act wisely, we need to stand united and we need to focus. And my concern is we don't focus and that we risk, that the new legislation actually creates barriers to ourselves because we're easy to see, we're easy to fix. Because we are based in the Nordics, we take the phone when the authority calls. They don't. And I think that's a huge risk. It works, apparently.
But then how do you react to the case that John mentioned? Like this also potential that this legislation is only used toward the internals, right? And that because, let's call it the local or national media. If these foreign powers or these foreign companies are not going to be listening, it's much easier to be able to use this legislation only to regulate internal publishers. Is that a problem, or how do we solve that?
I think definitely it's a risk. I'm not expert in that case, but it is a risk that we overregulate because it's the easiest tool, right? And then actually we risk to hurt our fundamental rights and values. And we need to protect them more than ever. And again, we need to focus. Also, policymakers have scarce resources, administration have scarce resources, and if they use time on this kind of piece of legislation, and I don't know, I'm not an expert, but I do know that if they spend time and resources and money of this kind of regulation, they can't, make smart decisions when it comes to, for example, infrastructure, critical infrastructure and tech.